The first memory I ever carried as a child was not of faces or voices, but of wind. Balkh, my birthplace, was a city of winds, warm in summer, sharp in winter, always swirling with scents, cinnamon, apricots, dust. I remember watching apricot blossoms fall from the trees like pale snow, their descent as graceful as a scholar's robe. The lanes of our neighborhood were alive with wheels and hooves, merchants and mystics. Camels groaned under the weight of silk and spices while dervishes sang verses no one understood but all somehow felt. There was noise, certainly, but beneath it lay a silence more profound than anything I have since encountered in libraries and courts. Children ran barefoot as I did, though I've often wondered if they too heard what I heard in the wind, that haunting, almost musical hum that seemed to rise from the cobbled streets themselves. My father, Ba-ad-Din Valid, was often called Sultan al-Ulam, the Sultan of Scholars. To many he was a pillar of Sunni orthodoxy, a jurist to be trusted on matters both divine and temporal. But to me, before anything else, he was the man whose voice lingered long after his words had faded. Even in childhood, I could feel that he walked with something vast inside him, a grief, perhaps, or a remembrance. He said that knowledge without presence was like wine in a sealed jar. It filled the space, but intoxicated no one. At night, while the moon buried itself behind the hills of Khorasan and men drowsed in the comfort of certainty, my father would whisper to me stories of the prophets, not as rigid doctrines, but as living rivers of glimpse and light. His voice braided scripture with longing. I learned early that there were two forms of scholarship, one that contained facts and one that dissolved them. In those early years, I played beside a small stream that trickled through the orchard behind our home. It was not mighty like the Oxus, but it was intimate. I loved how it whispered to the stones, how it caught the light and fractured it into little gems. I would scoop water into my palm and hold it close to my eyes, fascinated by how something so clear could hold so much. One afternoon in early spring, when the pomegranate trees had just begun to bear their first blood-bright blossoms, I cupped a bit of this water and stared into it. A golden cluster of sunlight landed in the hollow of my hand, catching on veins and shifting glass-like along my skin. In that moment, a question came to me, not from my mind, but from some place even deeper. If I lift this drop from the stream, is the stream made less? I could not answer then. I only watched as the water slipped through my fingers, gone before I could claim it. And yet, even as it vanished, a mysterious fullness pulsed in my chest. I felt as though I had been given something, not by the stream, but by the mystery that moved through it. That strange sensation returned often in those days, when I heard the deep call to prayer at dawn, vibrating through cold air, when I saw a crippled dog cared for tenderly by a beggar, when a storm broke and left the city breathing relief. I could not explain these visitations. I knew only that in each was a kind of knowing that books did not mention. My father called it doc, taste. He said certain truths were like honey, no amount of description could replace the act of tasting. And so my earliest philosophy, long before I ever read Aristotle or Al-Ghazali, was this: the world is braided with secrets only the heart can drink. And the heart, when open, is not a mere vessel, it is a mirror, a messenger, sometimes even a storm. Though I was a child, the idea of the divine as both distant and near had settled deep inside me. Allah was not merely the creator who resided above the seventh heaven, he was also the one whose breath stirred the reeds by the stream, whose love wrote itself into the curve of every branch. I once asked my father where God was when the Mongols burned villages or when a child drowned in the irrigation canals. He didn't answer, not with words. He only looked at me and placed his hand on my chest. At first I thought he was trying to calm me. But then I felt it, my heartbeat, steady and mysterious. That simple gesture has stayed with me all my life. Because it taught me something no lecture ever did. God is in the question, and in the silence that follows. He is not in the answer, he is the answer, waiting to be unveiled in longing hearts. Once, during a journey beyond the city walls, I walked with a caravan carrying spices westward toward Nishapur. I remember our passage through a narrow mountain pass where the wind grew fierce. The peaks were frightening, but their silence was greater than their size. Along that path I had a vision, an inner one, not made of colors or sounds, but of intuition. I felt, without knowing how to say it, that I was bound to all the other travelers, to the stones that pushed up beneath our horses' hooves, to the distant falcon circling the desert floor. I did not feel small. Strangely, I felt enormous, not in ego, but in presence. As though something older than my body lived in me and remembered the turning of galaxies. I did not know it yet, but that moment became the seed of a truth that would later unfurl into the words, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." Back in bulk, in my quietest moments, would sometimes press my ear to the earth. I don't know what I hoped to hear, a word from the beneath the world, perhaps, or the music the stars carried upwards through the soil. What I found instead was a rhythm, a pulse. And I began to understand that everything in creation, whether clouds or ants, seeks the one. This seeking was not weakness. It was the soul's secret compass. And if the compass needle pointed inward, it meant that the destination was not distant, it was inside. Thus my childhood, though framed by the silk-scented dignity of my father's court and the stern beauty of religious law, was not limited to outer teachings. Unseen, underneath the rituals and recitations, another kind of learning began blossoming quietly, like a fig tree behind an old, weathered wall. Before I ever met shams of Tabriz, before I whirled in ecstasy or poured poetry into the pages of the Masnavi, the first grace had already fallen. I had glimpsed the mystery that each of us carries not a portion of the divine, but its fullness, compressed like the ocean into a single drop. That, I believe, is what first whispered itself to me through the wind in bulk. The road carved its way not only through mountains and deserts, but through the delicate tissue of my soul. When the Mongol armies began their brutal march across the Persian plateau, bringing fire to cities and silence to scholars, our family could no longer pretend that holy words or noble status could shield us. Bulk faltered beneath the hoofbeats of a people who spoke no language we knew and had no interest in the Quran, nor in the subtle music of philosophy. My father gathered his manuscripts, kissed the ancestral soil, and we set out. I was perhaps 12 or 13, young enough to marvel at new landscapes, old enough to mourn what we left behind. We did not know where destiny would lead us. We only knew we could not return. And so, we followed the thread of exile into the unknown. We traveled first toward Nishapur. The road unraveled like a poem made of thirst, sand, and starlight. Everything was in motion, camels, clouds, conversations. A caravan is made of stories, not just bodies. In the space between cities, pride melts. Titles are of no use when wind lashes your face and all you have is a crust of bread at dawn to sustain you. I listened more than I spoke on those journeys, learning the language of travelers, a blend of fatigue and wonder. Some spoke of saints buried beneath the dunes, whose tombs still wept with rosewater. Others debated free will and fate with the casual fire of hungry men. Yet more often I watched rather than joined. I watched the way bread was divided among strangers. The way a mother pressed her face into the neck of her sleeping child. These were not lesser teachings, these were revelations. In Nishapur, destiny sent me a messenger in the form of an old man whose bearing contained a mystery I could only describe later. He was Farid Dinar, the renowned poet and mystic who had written The Conference of the Birds. By strange grace or strange design, my father brought me to him. He looked at me not as a child or novice, but as someone already carrying something ancient. There was no kindness in his gaze, nor any condescension. Only clarity, sharp and unsettling. He handed me a book, his own Allahinama, and said, as if bestowing a secret I had long forgotten, "The sea is not outside you, child, it roars within." I felt those words soak through my skin like desert rain. What did it mean? That I was more than I appeared? Or that truth did not arrive from books but bloomed from within the heart itself? I walked away dazed, the book clutched to my chest as if it might fly away. That single sentence by her cracked something open in me. Until then, I had imagined knowledge as something to be gathered, like dates from palm trees or scrolls from inner chambers. But now I began to ask, what if the true library lies buried within my own chest? What if every verse I would one day recite was already echoing in the cradle of my soul, waiting only for remembrance? I felt suddenly larger than my feet could carry, as if my body were too small for the mystery beginning to flood it. From Nishapur we made our way to Baghdad, then to Mecca, journeying like the ancient prophets, carried by hooves and prayer. Each city left its mark. In Baghdad, I explored ancient libraries, where scrolls wrote kingdoms of meaning in ink that still smelled of longing. There I first encountered the precision of Greek reason, the sharp intellect of dialectical minds who argued over existence as if it were a map to be drawn and claimed. In Damascus, the minarets stood like fingers pointing not just to heaven but inward. The Sufi zawiyas were hidden like secrets, nestled beside mosques where the faithful performed their duty without knowing their thirst had not yet been quenched. By the time we reached Aleppo, my mind was drenched in knowledge. I could recite law, interpret hadith, analyze metaphysics with the confidence of someone twice my age. I had become what others hoped I would become, a scholar. A worthy heir to my father. But something within me began to itch with restlessness. There were nights when I left my chamber and walked the silent courtyards while everyone slept. Above me, the stars threw their unintelligible wisdom across the sky. I kept asking, is this all? To know the categories of angels, the outer code of divine command? I did not doubt the sacredness of the law, but I began to wonder if discipline without intimacy leads only to pride. Two things began to grow inside me during those wanderings. One was a reverence for words that were not spoken out loud, the other was an ache. A longing that had no form, no object, no name. It was not desire in the earthly sense. It was deeper. It began in the chest, but it moved downward and upward simultaneously, spreading like warm wind, leaving me both hollow and full. Rumi, the scholar, was being stretched into something else. I began to recognize the signs of this ache in others, the old woman whispering to her prayer beads with her eyes closed, the carpenter who sang to his tools, the shepherd who spoke to his sheep as though they were kin. There was a hidden book open before the eyes of the world, and few were reading it. Often during our pauses between cities, when tents were raised and the fire laid down low, I would lie on my back and watch the stars. One night I found myself weeping, the tears coming not from grief, but from something else, something wordless. I felt, as clearly as I feel my pulse now, that I was not apart from the stars, or from the fire, or from any of the companions who slept around me. I belonged to everything. Everything belonged to me. Not from possession, but from recognition. I was not separate. I was not a passerby looking in through the windows of existence. I was inside the house, as the house itself. The ocean had sent a wave into my being to remind me, you are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop. I could not yet fully articulate what stirred inside me, but I knew I had touched the hem of something eternal. My teachers began to notice the questions I asked were changing. I no longer wished to debate the finer points of jurisprudence for the sake of precision alone. I was drawn to the stories of Majnun and Layla, of Rabia's lantern and the talking birds of Suleiman. These were not childish tales, they were veiled parables of the soul's journey. I began to see language not merely as a tool for order, but as a flame that could illuminate the inner terrain of the self. The poem, when true, became a doorway, and each word, an invitation to cross beyond the borders of separation. By the time we finally settled in Konya, years had passed since the fall of Balkh. I was no longer the boy who played near the stream. But something from that child had remained, the quiet knowing that within each moment, within each atom, a doorway waits. Through hardship and exile, sandstorms and scriptures, I had come to cherish more than knowledge, I had begun to feel. And this feeling, this sacred ache, was the compass that pointed to home. Not a home of walls and carpets, but to the eternal dwelling within the self. I was being readied for something, though I knew not what. And so the desert taught me, The road instructed in silence. And before I ever met my true teacher of flame and disappearance, before shams, I had already begun to remember the truth, that I was not a student collecting drops, but the hidden ocean remembering its own tide. Kanya welcomed me as both a place of rest and a crucible. The city lay spread out beneath pale blue skies, its rooftops burning gold at sunset, minarets rising like supplications carved in stone. We arrived weary from our wandering, a family stripped of our ancestral city and all its certain rhythms. Among these new streets, my father's reputation ran ahead of us, opening doors that might have remained shut to exiles. After his death, the community, seeing in me both his likeness and his learning, entrusted me with his position. I ascended the minbar on trembling legs, still haunted by deserts and the ghosts of bulk, my voice steady only because I borrowed the tone I heard as a child from my father, the way a boy learns to write not with his own hand but by tracing over the lines made by the hand of his teacher. I spoke of law, recited verses, and the people nodded, satisfied. I excelled at the sciences sacred and the profane, the subtle architecture of inheritance law, the tapestry of hadith, the labyrinthine traditions of jurisprudence. My students crowded at my feet, eager to soak up the tradition I now embodied. Each question answered was another brick that fortified my role as scholar and judge. Respect and comfort came, as did responsibilities, mediating disputes, rendering verdicts, leading prayers with a gravity that to the outside world looked like certainty. Yet beneath that public certainty, there pulsed a private unease. I inhabited my father's place, wore his robes, taught his lessons, but within me there stirred a sense of incompletion, a yearning with no clear shape. Often, as I walked home from the madriz at night, I watched the lanterns set in the doorways flicker, wind snatching their flames. The city's calm, the regular call to prayer, the rhythm of commerce, the patterns of life, contrasted with something wild in my chest, that restless ache seeded by exile and watered by the secret teachings of longing. I wondered whether piety was merely a mask for fear, and whether knowledge collected without inner fire might simply be another kind of sleep. Even as I wrote commentaries and explained the inner meanings of hadith, there was a part of me that was not speaking, a depth that the words did not reach. One afternoon, in the mosque, I was teaching on the subject of inheritance, laying out the branches of the law before my students, how shares were divided, how intention changed what was due. My lips spoke what tradition demanded, but at that moment, through the heavy door, came a beggar with a battered tambourine. He did not seek alms, nor interrupt, he simply played. The note, clear, mournful, woven from both hunger and hope, cut through my discourse. For a heartbeat, I heard in that single vibration a harmony I had never understood until then, a subtle, endless music that threads through every action, every pause, and is lost when we confine ourselves to the known. I faltered, my voice trailing off as the students glanced between their silent master and the invisible visitor outside. It was a moment I covered with authority, but inside, a wave crashed, toppling the sandcastles of certainty I had built. These small disturbances grew to occupy my quiet thoughts. Each day was spent navigating the outward rituals, recitations, judgments, the council of dignitaries who looked to me for wisdom, children who mimicked my every gesture, scribes who waited upon my commentaries. Yet in solitude, I felt the parchments dry as abandoned orchards, the ink brittle as long-spilled wine. I began to sense a great river flowing beneath the surface of everything. The prayers, the judgments, the learning, all were vessels, but where was the water to fill them? I desired a knowledge that did not merely define the world, but illuminated it, a warmth that did not just list the names of angels but opened my heart to their presence. When doubts circled as vultures around my certainties, I returned to the stories that had once stirred me as a child, the tales my father told of prophets who broke open the world with longing, who found God not in rules alone but in revelation and rapture, even in despair. I yearned for an encounter, some sign that the architecture of the law was not a tomb for wonder, but a temple where the beloved could be glimpsed. It was a tension that pressed in on my prayers, a hunger that the routines of scholarship could not satisfy. Conversations with my students and peers grew sharper. Some noticed my wandering attention, my tendency to answer legal questions with parables, my love for stories where mystery outshone method. I must have seemed restless, perhaps even dangerous, to those who prized orthodoxy above all. I was both present and absent, there at every council, yet haunted by an absence that called to me like a vision just out of reach, a song only the dead seemed able to sing. There was comfort, still, in the patterns of daily life, the weight of the Quran in my hands, the quiet patience of my family, the prayers that marked the passage of time with the familiar certainty of sunrise and sunset. And yet, even in comfort, I felt adrift. The ocean I had heard murmuring in my youth now thundered, threatening to drown the little drop of self I had so carefully constructed, a drop the world saw as sufficient, yet which I knew to be only the most fragile surface. In those years before Shams, I began to hear the call more frequently, sometimes in a line of poetry murmured by an old baker, in the touch of a child who looked at me as if I could explain grief, in the gold light slanting across the mosque floor during afternoon prayer. The call was urgent yet patient, asking me to surrender what I thought I knew for something I could not yet name. It was in this tension, between what was expected and what was possible, between the scholar and the seeker, that the first faint glimmers of transformation appeared. I was beginning to understand, though it shamed me to confess it then, that the fire which incinerates pretense is not an enemy but the truest companion. It was the hint of a storm that would uproot everything, my name, my knowledge, my place in the world, and reveal the ocean hidden within the drop. But before the storm broke, I stood, outwardly composed, inwardly on the edge of awakening, listening for a music only the heart can hear. It was the 15th day of November, in the year 1244, though dates mean little in the presence of eternity. If I had known what that morning would bring, perhaps I would have walked slower to the madrasa, or prayed longer, or looked more closely at the faces in the sugar merchant's bazaar as I passed. But I remember it clearly, because the sun burned gently in a sky swept clean by the wind the night before, and the city of Konya buzzed with its usual pattern, dealings of trade, the sound of donkeys, shouts spilling from market stalls, and the hush of mid-morning prayer edging near. I moved through it with the familiar weight of my robes and the even more familiar weight of identity, scholar, teacher, jurist, leader. Wise men nodded. Students sought my eyes for reassurance. The city bowed subtly as I passed, not from fear, but trust. I had given them years of consistency, of clarity. But within me, something had begun to fracture, quietly, like a hairline crack in glass. That was the day I met the sun, though it was veiled as a man. Not in golden light, not in celestial fire, but in human form, dust on his robe, wildness in his eyes, and a stillness that moved more than thunder. I was riding on horseback, accustomed to the rhythm of hooves between patterned storefronts, when he stepped into my path. He did not kneel or salute, nor did he delay like other passers-by. Instead, he walked directly up to my mount and seized the bridle with his bare hand. I remember the sharp intake of my breath, and the immediate tension in my guards, ready to strike him down had I but raised a finger. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because his eyes, God help me, his eyes held galaxies. They held nights I had dreamed but never slept through, lifetimes I had not lived but remembered in his gaze. He looked at me, not with admiration, nor deference, but with complete familiarity, as if he had met, not me, but the truth inside me I had hidden even from myself. He asked a question, calmly but piercingly, who is greater, the Prophet Muhammad or Bayezid Bastami? I was stunned. It was neither a respectful greeting nor a request for judgment. It was a challenge meant for the soul, not the mind. I remember the words I offered in reply, measured, scholarly, theologically correct. The Prophet is the greatest of all beings. Bayezid merely spoke his ecstatic states aloud, but the Prophet carried his oceans of knowing silently, hidden under the shroud of prophethood. The man, Shams al-Din of Tabriz, though I did not know his name yet, smiled, not from satisfaction, but as if I had opened the first door in an infinite hallway we were now destined to walk together. That moment was the first crack of thunder across the clear sky of my structured life. I did not know it yet, but the scholar that wore my name, the jurist so lauded for spiritual discipline, had already died. Only his body still sat on horseback. My soul, in that instant, had leapt off and begun following this wild, luminous stranger through unseen corridors. We walked together, farther from the city, past the curious stares. I could sense the discomfort this man stirred in others. He did not behave as a man should. He spoke to animals. He wept in silence. I remember how, once seated in my study, surrounded by rows of sacred books, commentaries, Quranic tafsir, hadith traditions, he stood and stared at them. He pointed toward the heavy shelves and asked, "What is this?" I answered proudly, as one who has spent his life among scrolls would, detailing their importance, and the years spent collecting and interpreting them. And then, to my horror, he walked over and began knocking them one by one to the ground. Volume after volume thudded like broken promises onto the floor, some falling open, some snapping shut with a finality that stung my heart. I rose in outrage. "These are treasures," I said, nearly shouting. "Have you no reverence?" He merely watched me, that ever-burning eye of his clear and unwavering. Then slowly, he began to pick up the books, one by one, and held them close. I saw something unexplainable. No water touched the pages, although he lifted them from the fountain into which he had dropped them. No ink smeared. It was as if the written word had surrendered itself to him. He looked at me and said, "You must drown your knowledge in the waters of love. Then it will live again." That night, and many that followed, we didn't sleep. We talked. Not as two men with words to exchange, but as twin stars drawn together by a current older than their light. Hours would pass without a single word spoken, and yet entire worlds unfurled between us. He would ask questions that unraveled my carefully constructed reasoning. "What is your soul's first memory?" he once whispered. My lips hesitated, not because I did not know, but because I had never been taught that memory had anything to do with the soul. With Shams, I was no longer the master. I was the pupil, the dust, the flame in search of fire. My household whispered. My students withdrew. My social standing began to shimmer, unstable. But I could not unfasten myself from him. I did not want to. Because near Shams, it was as though the air carried scent again, the stone spoke in riddles, and the divine ceased to be theory and became a burning presence in every breath. Once he asked me to place my hand over my chest. He did the same. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "It is not your heart that beats. It is God's drum inside you, calling you home in every thump." That simple gesture brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition of something I had always known but had forgotten, a primordial music dancing at the core of my existence. In his presence, I melted. All my language turned to ash around the fire of what he revealed without ever explaining. Shams did not teach in lectures. He taught in inversions, in contradictions, in the unbearable weight of unveiled silence. He taught by vanishing from a room mid-sentence. By laughing when I recited something serious. By weeping in the middle of nowhere, then telling me he wasn't weeping at all, but drinking something too sweet for the eyes to bear. I came to know then that true companionship is not comfort. It is fire. It is the breaking of every illusion held too long, too tightly. What Shams gave me was not peace. He gave me devastation. A holy unraveling. We must lose the path to find it. And so, his friendship tore me from my positions, my pride, my prominence. But it returned something far more beautiful. It returned me to love. From that point forward, I was no longer Rumi the jurist alone, nor the respectable figure the city revered. I became a lover. Of what? Of the beloved whose name cannot be spoken, and yet lives on the tongue of every bird, every reed, every turning dervish. And Shams? He was the sun that scorched my garden so something wilder could grow. He was the whirlwind that tore down the house of my knowledge so that I could remember the sky. The days with Shams unfolded like pages I hadn't known existed in the book of my soul. Time, as I had understood it, lost its structure. Hours melted and blurred. Sunset bled into sunrise without apology. With him, hours passed in silence that said more than sermons, while a single glance between us could bear truths that paragraphs could only encircle awkwardly. What passed between us was not conversation in the ordinary sense, it was combustion. A word from him could light a fire within me that raged for days, burning away the layers I'd so carefully accumulated through years of study, scholarship, and control. I had known words, I had known thousands of them. I could entangle them, resolve their knots, trace lineage back through Quranic verses and the sayings of saints and scholars. But Shams spoke from a place that made my words feel brittle and pale. One evening, under a sky swollen with stars, I asked him what true knowledge was. He didn't answer with a speech. Instead, he picked up a handful of earth and whispered to it. Then he handed it to me. If you cannot hear it responding, he said, you are still deaf to the real truth. That night, I could not sleep. I held that earth in my palm like a relic, trying to listen not with my ears, but with the ear of the heart, the ear that has always existed beneath the cage of logic. By day, I still taught in the mosque when I had to, still judged disputes, offered prayers with the congregation and sat before scholars who now eyed me with suspicion and curiosity. But by night, I was consumed, burning at the altar of this invisible temple Shams had erected through his presence. My sons, my companions, my students, they all felt the shift. I, who had once walked with controlled grace and unwavering purpose, now moved like someone intoxicated. Wine without a cup. A song without an end. My joy terrified the people around me, because it could not be reasoned with, measured, or predicted. But it was real. More real than anything I had spoken, written, or taught before. Shams could be wild one moment and still as a mountain the next. He did not bow to authority, and he did not tolerate the posturing of scholars. Once, a highly respected jurist from Konya attempted to engage him in debate. Shams listened for a few minutes, then suddenly stood up and began spinning in the middle of the room. Everyone was aghast. When he stopped, he simply said, "The truth is not in your books, it is in your surrender." He walked away, leaving the man speechless, and me on the verge of tears. That night I began to feel something I had previously only read about, fana. The annihilation of the self, as the Sufis called it. But it was not a death. It was a kind of expansion beyond the cage of Bai. Not destruction, but union. Through Shams, I wasn't becoming nothing. I was becoming everything. There was one night in particular. The air was dry, cool, and the moon was hanging low enough to touch. We sat beneath a fig tree, saying nothing for an eternity. Then he finally spoke. "The soul is not in the body," he said. "The body is inside the soul." That sentence hit me like lightning. It cracked open the floor of my understanding. What if the entirety of this world, all its weight, pain, and joy, was not outside of us, but inside? What if God didn't dwell above, judging from afar, but sat quietly inside our chest, behind the heartbeat? In that moment, I felt myself falling inward, falling, yet grounded. Floating, yet rooted in something vast and real. The self I had known so long began to disappear like mist. I was becoming perfume, smoke, air, nothingness filled with presence. My family, especially Aladdin, my son, began to resent what was happening to me. They saw me less and less. When I was present, I was distant. They said Shams had bewitched me. They weren't entirely wrong. Bewitchment is exactly what love does. It reorders reality, explodes the world and paints it anew. And Shams was not simply a companion. He was a mirror. I saw myself reflected in him not as I was, but as I could be, as I once was before I slipped into the slumber of roles and respectability. I did not love him as one loves a friend or brother. I loved him as flame loves the air that feeds it. My soul found its echo vibrating within his. That was a truth too immense and too scandalous for many to comprehend. There were whispers, accusations. People began to avoid me in the streets. Some of my students left, muttering of heresy, of madness. The elders of the city gathered in private, worried. The great Jalal al-Din has gone mad, they said. He gives his nights away to a wandering dervish who speaks in riddles and casts doubt on the law. But how could I explain that the law, followed without the inward fire of love, is like a riverbed without water? Beautiful, perhaps, but dry. Without bliss. Without movement. Then came the moment I will never forget. It was just before dawn, and I had been up all night pacing, trying to transcribe what had erupted in my chest in the form of a burning line of verse. Shams came in and sat across from me. He lit a candle and placed it between us. "Rum," he said softly, "what is the difference between this candlelight and the light that burns in your soul?" I stared. I saw it. I started quoting scripture about divine light, lectures I had memorized. He stopped me with a look. That look, the kind that makes you forget everything you think you know. He leaned forward and whispered, "Melt, and you'll understand." I could feel it then, melting. My certainties, my prestige, my measurements of distance between God and myself, all dissolving into something vast and borderless. I was not this body, or this intellect, or these words. I was melting into the source itself. I was the wax, longing to receive the fire. And Shams? He was the match thrown fearlessly into my chest. It was after that poetry began to pour from me like water breaking through stone. Not written with the mind, but dictated by something deeper. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and find verse on my lips before I could open my eyes. A line would leap from me fully formed, as if it had waited centuries to be spoken aloud. I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. The fire Shams lit inside me could not be contained by prose, by rational speech. It needed rhythm, rhyme, flight. It needed poetry. It needed music. It needed dance. I began to move through this new language, not as a form of beauty but as a necessity, as breathing. I was no longer simply thinking about God. I was praising Him with every part of my being, my voice, my feet, my breath, my tears. Shams had not taught me through instruction. He had taught me through incineration. This was not just transformation. It was transmutation. The base elements of who I had been, proud, precise, revered, were being turned into something finer, subtler, freer. And no one but he, the wandering dervish from Tabriz, had been able to strike that alchemical fire in me. So yes, the scholars frowned. The city murmured. My family suffered. And I mourned their distance. But how could I turn away from the one who had turned me toward the one? How could I step back from the cliff's edge once I had tasted that terrifying, exultant freedom of freefall into God? Love isn't gentle. It doesn't arrive with predictable scripture. It doesn't ask for your permission before devouring everything false inside you. It demands everything. And to Shams I gave my everything, not because he asked it, but because in his presence, I remembered that nothing was ever mine to keep. There was a morning, one that lives eternally in my body, in the roots of my breath, when Shams and I stood beside the old cistern outside the city walls. It was a quiet, silver dawn, that hour when the world still remembers the dreams it dreamt in sleep. He had woken me before the town's first stirrings, tugging my robe with that silent authority he always carried. "Come," he mouthed, his breath a wisp of warmth in the chill, "before the sun wakes the witnessing." I followed him, wordless, still shaking off the sweetness of slumber, only beginning to recognize what kind of dream I was already walking in. We reached the cistern, and he sat on its crumbling ledge, gesturing for me to do the same. The water below was still, dark, undisturbed, holding the pale moon in its reflection. For a few minutes, we simply sat, no words, no gestures, no explanations. That was how Shams often taught. He would speak, but not with speech. He would turn silence into a living, moving current that would carry me into spaces no map of reason could chart. I began to sense that this was not a place we came to visit, it was a chamber hidden at the heart of reality. The square of stone beside the ancient water, the air between us, the long shadow of the fig tree nearby, all of it shimmered with a kind of sacred presence. Then he tore a leaf from its branch. It fell with that slow, weightless descent that comes from surrender, not death. He held it over the dark surface of the cistern, letting it drift down until it hit the water with a tiny ripple. Carefully, he scooped up water with the leaf, cradling the trembling droplet in its green palm. Raising it to the line of morning light, he watched it glisten, then turned his eyes toward me. That gaze, how do I describe it? It held me completely, as if nothing else had ever existed. Then he spoke, not loudly, but so that every corner of the sky heard. Do you still believe that this is a drop and the sea is something beyond it? I did not answer. I couldn't. I had lived so long thinking in opposites, self and other, teacher and student, drop and sea. I had not noticed the subtle violence that such duality performs in the soul. The thought that I could be a part of the whole, but never the whole itself, had always seemed modest, even virtuous. But now, in the weight of that question, modesty felt like a veil, like chains of gold disguising their bondage as beauty. He tilted the leaf slightly, and the droplet slid into his palm. It trembled there, a perfect curve of sun-struck light, and I stared into it as if into a mirror. I saw within it everything, the fig leaf shaking in the breeze, the face of the sky, my own silhouette hunched in reverence. He whispered again, this time softer, with no need for grandeur, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a single drop. Tears sprang to my eyes, not from sentimentality, but from recognition. I was remembering something I must have once known, long before books, before language, before form. Something that existed when I was but a breath in the lungs of existence, before I even took shape in my mother's womb. That truth was not new, it was ageless, timeless, older than creation itself. Shams was not giving me knowledge. He was unveiling what had always been there, the knowing within the marrow, the truth woven into the very threads of existence. I stared at that drop trembling in the palm of his hand. Within it, the entire world danced. Every sky I had ever slept under. Every word I had read. Every face I had loved or judged. Entire galaxies spun quietly within that curve of water, a convex mirror made by God's own word. And then, suddenly, the boundary between the drop and me dissolved. I was the water. I was his hand. I was the sunlight refracting through the fragile surface. There was no more difference between Rumi and the real. I, this so-called scholar, this judge of sacred texts, had been a sleeping sea dreaming it was a cup. Something inside my chest bowed. I didn't mean to move. It happened through me, not from me. I went to the earth, burying my face in the dust at his feet, no longer caring if sermon hall whispers would call it idolatry or madness. Let them speak. Let them gather and protest, raise legal objections, challenge the orthodoxy of my transformation. What happened beside that cistern was beyond books, beyond decrees. It was truth, pure and sudden, as light exploding from a long-shut box. When I finally sat back up, I looked at Shams again, and everything had changed. Not because he had changed, but because the veil between what I saw and what truly is had been lifted. Shams was still dressed like a vagrant dervish. His hands were still stained with dust, his beard still coarse and wild. But now I saw the sun seated in flesh. I saw the friend who is the flame, the teacher who annihilates doubt not through argument but through presence. A mirror so polished he offers you nothing of himself, only your own face, unmasked. In the days that followed, the moments beside that cistern became a symphony that replayed itself in my breath. I saw the ocean in everything after that. A child chasing birds in a courtyard. God, remembering his own playfulness. A broken tile, a verse about impermanence, the call of a morning dove at dusk, the sigh of the lover echoing through matter. I would walk through the bazaar and every merchant, every beggar, every scent of spice and sweat and rosewater was another verse in the grand poem. I began hearing it everywhere, not with my ears, but with the inner ear. I had no choice but to respond. And so, the poems began pouring from me like rain from a cloud too full to hold its silence. These were not verses crafted with intent. I did not write them, they flowed through me. I dictated them to those who stayed close, burning with their own longing. My students struggled to keep up. Some wept as they wrote, not because they understood every word, but because they felt the current beneath the ink. We weren't composing poetry, we were part of something greater than creation expressing itself through us. The words knew more than we did. And still, Shams remained my axis, my Qibla. Not in worship, but in constance. In presence. He stirred me like wind stirs flame, not to destroy or scatter, but to enliven. I followed him not as a student follows a master, but as a moth follows heat. What truth lay at our core was one and the same. We both remembered. That was the secret. And so he continued provoking revelation, not with grand gestures, but with simplicity, lifting a cup of tea with both hands as if offering it to the divine, listening to a street fool with reverence, weeping when a boy sang an off-key devotional song outside the madrasa. I would ask him, why tears, and he would smile with such softness, saying, because even wrong chords carry the echo of the one. One evening, I asked him, why do you give me all of this? Why do you empty the skies into my soul? He laughed, a laugh that cracked the world open. Oh Rumi, he said, I give nothing. I only knock on your chest until the door opens and the sea remembers it is not separate from the tide. The transformation was complete. My life no longer belonged to me. The things I had once built an identity upon, titles, scholarship, public stature, became shadows behind me. Where others saw the erosion of form, I felt the expansion of truth. I was no longer the drop seeking the sea. I was the sea, awakened inside the drop. That teaching, the one that has since been carved into stone and embroidered on silks, was not a metaphor to me. It was not lofty philosophy. It was my lived reality. When I said, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop, I wasn't offering a poetic comfort. I was speaking from within the depths of it, soaked and shattered by the gravity of that knowing. And once you've tasted the ocean in your own breath, how can you ever return to thimble-sized answers or measured prayers? That morning beside the cistern, with a trembling leaf cradling a single drop of water, I died as the man I had been. I was born again, not as a mystic, not as poet, not as lover, but as the ocean itself, flowing through the vessel of a man called Rumi. After that morning when the boundaries between self and the infinite dissolved, I found that my whole being was compelled toward expression, toward a surrender that was both movement and stillness, flame and silence. It manifested first, almost involuntarily, in the turning of my body, a yearning that could no longer be housed in form alone. It happened once, in the courtyard where the music from the reed flute wove its longing through the air, and my limbs answered. I rose, letting the music pass through me, feeling the axis of the world shift at the base of my spine. My right hand stretched upward, involuntarily seeking what descended, my left, instinctively turned toward the earth, to share what had been given. My body began to revolve, slowly at first, as if the earth itself was teaching my feet its own language. In that rotation, I forgot the stiffness of self. I forgot Rumi as scholar, judge, or poet. All that remained was longing and the tasting of the one beneath all names. I was not alone for long. Others, my students, companions, even those who first came merely to witness this spectacle, felt themselves drawn into that orbit. I explained nothing, for there was nothing to explain, only a music already moving through each of us, desperate for release. As we turned, the world seemed to fall away. Gold light spilled through the cypresses, merging with the sound of chanting, the rhythmic heartbeat of the drum, the eternal drone of the nay. Each sound was another facet of the one calling us to remembrance. In the midst of spinning, I caught glimpses of my companions' faces, rapt, tear-streaked, radiant, each one no longer contained in his own story, but joined in the great cosmic dance. Our garments flared like white lilies around our feet. All that was rigid became fluid. Tears, sweat, laughter, and silence circled and dissolved. Even time itself became irrelevant, breaking as each turn led us further from the earth and closer to the beloved source. In those first gatherings, there were no steps to memorize, no conscious choreography. Turning grew from the inside out, rising from a necessity deeper than the mind. My followers may have appeared as dancers, but each was a soul casting off the dust of separateness, seeking annihilation in the presence of the divine. Someone asked me, once, if I spun because I wished to leave the world behind. I told him, it was not an escape, but a return. Each revolution was a pilgrimage around the Kaaba within, binding the sacred outer to the unnameable inner. Our movement was both testimony and prayer. With every whirl, we whispered, La ilaha illa Allah with Makron H, there is nothing but the one. The city, of course, could not remain indifferent. Some watched from the shadows, marveling or frowning at the sight of learned men and poor students alike losing themselves in music and motion. The elders judged me mad, the jurists muttered of heresy, the pious feared for their own footing. But I heard the meaning that lived beneath their objections, a fear not of movement, but of being moved. The law had its borders, turning across them, carrying us into an intimacy that could not be dictated or described within the old certainties. Among those who gathered, the Sama, hearing, was more than listening to music. It was an immersion, a drowning in a current soundless to the ear yet thunderous to the heart. Before each gathering, we fasted, letting hunger burn away distraction. When the drum first sounded, it struck not just air but the gate of the heart. The flute's wail pierced the veil of self. Each turn, each note, carried us deeper into the ocean. Sometimes my companions would fall, overwhelmed by the sweetness and terror of nearness. Some wept, others laughed as if drunk. I, too, would lose all bearings, my mind scattering like leaves before the beloved's breath. In time, the movement grew roots, a form emerged from formless ecstasy. I showed them how to place their hands, the right palm open to the sky, the left to the earth. To turn with eyes open yet unfocused, seeing nothing, seeing everything. Their feet learned the path, the left planted, the right propelling the eternal spiral. I told them, you are planets, revolving around the sun of the heart. Each circuit is both departure and return. Our bodies became the words of a living poem, each of us an alphabet in the language of love. Music and poetry braided us together. The reed, when played, mourns its origin. It sings because it remembers being severed from the reed bed, always yearning for return. So too did we yearn in our revolving, ascending through remembrances, opening, burning, surrendering. The more we turned, the more the boundaries between self and brother vanished. There were no differences, no wealth, no poverty, no scholar, no ignorant one. Only waves rising in a single sea. Our circle was an echo of galaxies, our motion mirroring the vast, unseen orbits that bind the cosmos in the turning of love. I still recall, in quiet moments after the music had faded, how a strange, bone-deep relief would settle in the room, a silence deeper than any quiet, a peace that had no opposite. In that stillness, I heard the silent laughter of the one, sharing with us the secret the reeds, the stars, the water had always known. Movement is remembrance. To spin is to submit, to surrender the illusion of the fixed self, to fall, at last, into the arms of the real. As years went on, the Sama lived on beyond me, becoming both ritual and remembrance for those who came after. The city would later call us Mevlevis, the followers of my name, though all names dissolve in the dance. What began as a storm in my chest, a longing that could not be caged, became a tradition that outlived breath and bone, a living ocean in the shape of a circle, a memory of unity written cleanly in every soul that dares to turn. There came a time, after many seasons of turning and aching and igniting from within, when I no longer sought the beloved only through movement, but through stillness, and through words, though not words as they are typically known, not cold, lifeless syllables assembled for argument or persuasion, but words remembered in fire, drawn from the soul's deepest caves where silence has ripened into speech. I found myself, more and more often, sitting cross-legged on mats in dimly lit rooms, surrounded by those whose ears were still tender with wonder. They called me Maulana, my master, but I was no master of them, nor of myself. I was only a reed flute in the mouth of the beloved, pouring out melodies that I did not know were waiting inside me. I began to speak not to instruct, but because the truth within me pressed so heavily it had to escape lest it burn my silence to ash. In one of those gatherings, I remember watching the candlelight play across a bottle of ink, its reflection trembling like a soul awaiting release. I picked up my pen, and the story flowed, not a story of grand kings or remote ascetics, but of a grocer too tired to pray yet kept his scales honest, of a donkey driver who heard God's name in his animals bray, of a drunk who stumbled outside the tavern and wept because the stars reminded him of childhood. These were the vessels into which I poured oceans. I spoke of prophets walking barefoot, of saints hiding in the robes of shopkeepers, of the Almighty disguised as the breath between two complaints. My listeners often laughed, sometimes cried, but mostly they paused, stilled by what passed between my words. I remember dictating these teachings, these tales, to Husam Shalebi, who sat with a patience that carried the humility of mountains. He never rushed me. Sometimes I would say only a single line before falling into quietness again, my face wet with tears I couldn't explain. Other times the verses would pour like sudden rain, an unstoppable flood. Husam would write, tirelessly, attentively, his pen moving with reverence. We did this for years, my lips speaking mysteries I didn't know I knew, his pen scribbling them into something the world could hold. This became the Masnavi, not a book, but a garden, a ladder, a mirror, a lover. 6 volumes, each one a window into the soul, not mine alone, but the soul, a singular soul flowing eternally through you, me, the stars, the soil, the silence between 2 raindrops. In these stories, I braided donkeys and angels, kings and beggars, mice and prophets into the same fabric. I wanted people to taste what I had tasted, that there is no low or high except in our minds. The moment you crack the illusion of hierarchy, you find God waiting in the unlikeliest eyes. A fish seller might carry divine wisdom in the way he wraps his catch. A companionless widow might pour more light into the world than 100 imams. You must look with the eye of the heart, I said, not the eye of judgment. That is the eye that sees eternity stitched into every detail, the sacred blaze hiding in plain cloth. And what of the critics? The officials who approached me with scholarly suspicion, pressing their brows with indignation, asking, Maulana, do you not fear leading people astray with these tales of dancing peasants and jesters who speak in riddles? I smiled at them, gently. It is the formulaic mind that leads astray, I answered. The mind that believes it must measure God in lines and chapters, and sees contradiction where there is simply mystery. I asked them if they'd ever wept while reciting a legal decree. I told them love is the only real argument. Nothing else has ever persuaded anyone to truth. There was a scholar once, a man of stern precision, who mocked my mention of Majnun, the lover maddened by his beloved, Layla. Is this the example to offer seekers of God? He sneered. A lunatic crawling through the sand in search of a woman? I asked him, have you ever desired God the way Majnun desired Layla? Have you wept until you forgot yourself? Or do you chase God the way merchants chase gold? He had no answer, but his silence was more honest than if he'd argued. Scripture too, how I loved it. But I began to see that even the Quran is unread by those who refuse to let it burn away their illusions. Some recite it by heart and still do not live it. I said to my students often, don't just recite the word, become the word. Let it breathe through your hands, your service, your grief. Let it break your pride, empty your cup, widen your gaze. They would listen with solemn faces. Some understood. Others only nodded. Understanding cannot be forced. It only arrives when the heart turns soft like earth ready for seed. I began to see metaphors everywhere. The moon was no longer a distant stone, it became the mirror of longing. The sun was not just light, it was the divine revealing itself every day and hiding every night to train us in yearning. Even the market, noisy and coarse, became sacred ground. I would walk its alleys and see the faces of men and women, each one glowing, though unaware of their own brilliance. I wanted to fall to my knees before a cobbler once, just for the way he held his needle, so present, so empty of ego. That, too, was worship. As I spoke and wrote more, the world around me began to change in subtle ways. People approached me less as a distant figure of spiritual authority, and more like children drawn to fire for warmth. They came, broken-hearted, confused, newly widowed or joyfully married, not for answers, but to forget questions. They came to listen. Sometimes they asked me what the secret was, what technique I used to reach such closeness with God. I told them, flee the mind's fortress and fall into the heart's ruin. Faith isn't built, it's discovered beneath the rubble of self. Once I told a parable of a man who carried bread across a river thinking it was gold. He held it so tightly that by the time he arrived, it had molded and crumbled in his arms. Be careful what you cling to, I said, the hands that hold too tightly cannot receive grace. The longer I lived, the more I narrowed the distance between sacred and ordinary until they disappeared. That old division had always troubled me. As if God resided only in mosques and not in kitchens. As if prayer only happened on rugs and not in fields. So I wrote stories and poems to stitch the everyday back into the eternal. If someone told me, I have no time to pray, I would say, then bake your bread with such attention that your hands become dua. If someone said, my heart is too broken to seek God, I said, perfect. Enter through the crack. That's where the light resides. All my writing, all my teaching during those years became a tapestry woven from this one truth: there is no separation. The dualities we invent are shortcuts for those too afraid to face mystery. God is not up or down, far or near. God is the eye seeing, the breath exhaling, the hand reaching, the heart breaking. Once you realize this, everything becomes a lesson. Every ant a scripture. Every tear a verse. This was what I longed to give to those who came to me. Not answers, but vision. Not certainty, but intimacy. I didn't want disciples. I wanted companions, lovers, madmen, pilgrims who would walk with blistered feet and never once curse the road. Men who would dare to ask the question, who am I beneath this name and skin and title, and who wouldn't run from the answer, even if it shattered them. Looking back, I realized that whatever I taught, I did so not from knowledge, but from remembering. Shams may have vanished. His chair sat empty in our circle. But his gaze still burned beneath my ribs, his silence hummed beneath my words. I was not speaking alone. I was speaking for the fire that burned in both of us, and in every soul that has tasted one drop of truth and never been the same again. And if my words reached hearts, and they did, it wasn't because I was eloquent. It was because I had bled. I had longed so deeply, so utterly, that there was nothing left in me not soaked with love. That love became language. That language became the bridge. And over that bridge, souls are still walking, even now. There are silences in life that split you open wider than any storm, that arrive not like the thunder you anticipated, but like a breath stolen from your chest without forewarning. The day Shams disappeared was not heralded by omens. There were no howling winds, no eclipsed suns. He was simply there, and then he wasn't. Gone, like a flame that had burned through the last of the oil, quietly and completely, while you were still watching its light. I remember the throb under my ribs when I realized he was not coming back. I remember calling his name aloud into the morning light, into empty corridors, into the faces of my students who could not meet my eyes. And I remember the silence that answered, that still answers. They say a parting is painful. But this was something else. This was annihilation in its most intimate form. The outward world continued in its rhythm. Teacups clinked, merchants bartered, students asked their dull questions, but I was no longer within it. I walked through the city like a shadow dreaming it had form. The world had lost its color. I could not touch joy. I could not enter rooms without looking toward the door, thinking each creak was his footstep. At night, I would lean my body toward the breeze, as if he might ride in on the rustle of leaves. Even my own breath began to sound like a betrayal. How could I continue breathing when he no longer walked this earth? For weeks, then months, I wandered quietly, a stranger looking for something that language could no longer hold. Some said he fled. Some said he had been murdered. I too heard the whispers, knotted in jealousy and fear and righteousness, whispers with knives hidden between their teeth. I never asked. Because the body can die, yes. But love cannot be murdered. I knew Shams was not truly gone. What vanished was the form. What remained was the fire. I could feel it, even in my grief, especially in my grief. The part of him that had always been beyond figure or flesh had melted into me. Into everything. Still, I mourned. Deeply. Love does not make us immune to suffering. It heightens everything, intensifies every thread of emotion until the soul becomes a tapestry of unbearable beauty and sorrow. There were nights I buried my face in my hands and begged the sky to return him. I offered bargains, offered my status, my name, even my sanity. I told the winds, take everything, but give me back the face that taught me how to see. But silence was the only answer, and in time, I understood, Shams had not abandoned me, he had fulfilled his purpose. He was not missing. He had become the water in my eyes, the throb in my pulse, the movement of my pen. He had gone into the ocean, and its waves now spoke his name through my breath. And so I began to pour. No longer poems shaped by joy alone, but those carved by longing, grief, rage, rapture, and something beyond all of them. The verses came faster than before. I dictated to Husam endlessly, often unable to stay seated. I would cry out Sham's name in every second or third line, not as invocation, but as invocation's fruit. The very syllables, Shams breeze, became for me a prayer, a doorway, a lamplit within darkness. Those who heard my poems assumed I longed for a man. They reduced it to friendship, or else accused it of something even more mundane. But how could I explain that I was not writing for a man, but for a sun hidden behind time itself? My grief was not for the missing. My grief was the absence of boundaries between the seeker and the sought, the drop and the ocean, and the unbearable light of knowing that even merging cannot protect you from longing. I became fire walking across every poem. And the fire, rather than consume me, transformed me. People began to gather again. They heard me speak and wondered how someone so broken could radiate such heat, such clarity, such passion. They asked me, Rumi, have you gone mad from grief, or has it made you a saint? I answered them with poems, never explanations. I told stories of candles longing to melt, of fish dreaming of desert, of lovers searching for the bearers of their own breath. Through these tales, I handed them mirrors. There is one afternoon I still remember as clearly as my own skin. I had been dictating for hours, pouring out lines like rivers unstopped. I stood up, dizzy with the current flowing through me, and I cried out, why are these words still coming? How can I still speak when all I love has turned to ash? Husam reached out his hand and said softly, because he's not gone, Maulana. He's within you now. That broke me. Not from pain, but from the weight of truth embedded in that simple sentence. Yes. Yes. Shams had not walked away. He had entered me. He had become every breath I took, every word I uttered. His disappearance was not departure, it was descent into the depths of my being. I began to see him everywhere. Not in visions, but in the generosity of a stranger's smile, in the way a child's fingers curled around a fig leaf, in the silence hanging between two verses not yet spoken. I was no longer looking for his figure on the street. I was listening for him in wind that passed through reed flutes, feeling him in the space between heartbeats. Once, a breeze passed through an open window in the middle of a poem, and the curtain lifted in a way that reminded me of the hem of his robe. I fell to my knees with gratitude, whispering, "You are here. You are always here." I understood, fully and painfully, that this was the real test of love, not what you do in presence, but what you do in absence. Can you remain faithful when the form dissolves? Can you still whirl when the eye finds nothing to rest on? Can you continue the dance when the music goes silent, trusting instead the rhythm that now rises from within? So I wrote. I spun. I wept. I sang. Shams had become not only the direction of my longing but the fuel in my veins. And through that, love itself became my only religion. Doctrines faded like mist. Debate felt hollow. I wanted only to love more deeply, to strip away every veil until I could stand naked before the real, asking nothing, desiring only to be consumed. The people in Kanya began to understand that I had changed, not back into the man I was before Shams, but into someone they could no longer categorize. I wore the same robes, I recited the same prayers, but my breath was different. It carried the scent of fire. Some worshipped what I had become. Others feared it. But I didn't care. I hadn't been writing for them. I wrote because I had to. Because if I didn't, the verses would break me open from the inside out. Because my soul, stretched by loss, deepened by longing, no longer needed the presence of the beloved in flesh. I had become the doorway he once knocked on. And so you ask me, did I lose him? I tell you, no. I became him. He poured himself into me like wine into a cup, like sun reflected on still water. My grief was not the end of our story. It was its consummation. 1,000 times I may call his name still, and 1,000 times the wind might carry it away. But I know this now with every ripple of my blood, the ones who truly belong to your soul never leave, they take root there. And when they disappear from the world, they bloom in your heart, feeding you with fire, until your flame lights the path for others losing their own beloveds to the invisible. Shams was never just a man. Shams was the threshold. And through him, I walked straight into the arms of what I had been seeking all along, absolutely. Here's the final elaboration of part 10 in the same detailed and introspective style as the previous parts, continuing from Rumi's perspective. As the final years of my life gathered around me like twilight lengthening over a quiet garden, I began to feel time loosening its grip. Not in dread or regret, no, but with a kind of softness, like a trusted friend drawing the curtains for sleep. My body, once full of fire that turned with the Sama, that danced under the stars and burned with verse, now ached quietly with a knowledge more silent than any poem. I could no longer walk as quickly. My hands trembled with age. But the tremble was not weakness, it was the echo of all the trembling the soul does when it is close to the source. People still came, sometimes with questions, often with confessions, always with their inner wounds just beneath the surface of their words. I listened, not as Maulana, not as the scholar they once revered, not even as the poet they now adored, but simply as a mirror. I had nothing left but presence, and perhaps that is everything. Such simplicity is both the end and the beginning of the spiritual path. There is no I left to defend. All that remained was breath, and the one breathing it. I knew death was coming. I had known it since the day I truly began to live, since the day Shams set my heart on fire and turned my identity to ash. It had never frightened me. We do not fear a door once we've seen the holiness that waits behind it. I had glimpsed eternity in a leaf, in a tear, in a single note of the nay. How could I resist returning to the heart of that beauty? What is death but the final merging, the last veil lifted? People around me mourned in anticipation. They called doctors, herbalists, spiritual healers. Some fasted and prayed on my behalf. I blessed them for their love, but I smiled quietly. They did not yet understand. I was not dying, I was dissolving into the beloved. I had been melting for years. This body of mine was merely a house for the turning of spirit, a humble bowl that had overflowed with longing. Now it had served its purpose. Let it crack. Let it return to dust. What had entered through it, what had danced and sighed and sung through it, would never vanish. They asked me what they should do when I died. Some begged me to give final instructions. Some wanted to know what legacy I wished to leave, what should become of the Mevlevi order, what rituals and structures should be preserved. I told them none of that mattered. Keep the fire alive, I said. Don't worry about building shrines, become the shrine. Don't argue over my words, live them. Let the turning continue not because it is tradition, but because your hearts cannot bear to stay still in the absence of love. I told them not to grieve. Do not dress in black, I said. Do not wail. This day, this crossing over, is not an end. It is a union. It is my wedding night. Shabi Aruz, I called it, my night of union. I had waited my whole life for this moment, not to escape the world, but to fully return to that which had given me the longing in the first place. And so, as my final breath approached, I lay still, surrendered, completely at peace. The pain of the body was light compared to the pull of the beloved. My heart beat slower, as if gathering itself into silence. I could hear the music even then, far away perhaps to others, but close to me. The subtle pulse of creation itself tuning its rhythm with my departure. It was not sorrowful. It was celebration. Every cell in me whispered, yes. 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 In those final hours, the past did not play like a film before my eyes. No. It was the present that opened infinitely, revealing the essence that had always lived within form. Shams was there, not in memory, but as presence. The face I once loved in longing was now the face I wore in silence. I had become the mirror in which he once showed God. Now I carried no need for reflection, I was touching the light directly. And then, breath left me like a wave receding into the great deep. Not abruptly. Not sincere. Like a lover turning into the embrace of the night. I greeted it with open arms. And so I was gone. But only the shell of me. What remains, this river of poems, of turning, of music, of fire, that is not mine alone. It is yours. It is God's. It is the ocean inside the drop remembering itself. Years will pass. Centuries will turn. People will say my name, read my verses, trace the spiral of the dervish as if looking for a center. But my request to you, my dear reader, wherever and whenever you may find me, is simple. Do not search for me in tombs or titles. I lie not beneath marble. Come to me in breath, in silence, in your own longing. When your heart breaks, I will be there in the rhythm of its cracking. When you turn, whether in dance, or in a moment of stillness between thoughts, I will be the wind that moves you. When you love without a reason, without boundary, I will be the echo in your chest calling, yes, go deeper. I am not gone. I am the ocean, and I am inside your drop. Turn. Thou. Burn. And remember. In the final years of my life, something inside me began to quiet, to settle like stirred water returning to stillness. The fire that had once roared through my limbs now flickered with gentler grace, steady and warm. I did not miss the storm. I had lived the storm, become it, been consumed by it, and reborn through it. I had danced in flames and sung through ashes. Now, I was less a flame and more the light the flame leaves behind long after the burning is done. My students still gathered. Pilgrims still came. Husam still sat by my side, recording the verses that echoed from my heart like the steady tolling of a sacred bell. But I sensed that the pen was nearing its final line, the wine its final drop. The air around me had changed, thinner somehow, luminous, threaded with the scent of departure. And yet, I had no fear. Death, to most, is a thief in the night, a shadow at the edge of the room. But to me, death had long ceased to be a stranger. I had greeted its cousin many times, in surrender, in ecstasy, in the breaking open of love. I had dissolved into shams, into silence, into poetry. I had lost myself in turning, in tears, in the fire of the heart. Each time I disappeared, I was pulled deeper, carried gently toward the one. So now, when death finally came for me, not as a metaphor, but as the final, real breath, I was not reluctant. I did not weep. I opened my arms to it as one opens the arms to a long-awaited beloved at last returned from exile. I told my companions not to mourn. I told them, when I die, don't wear black. Don't cry in the streets. Don't close your eyes in grief. Celebrate. Light lanterns. Sing the songs we've sung. Turn in the circle one more time. They asked me, how could we not grieve you, Master? How could silence not fall when you no longer walk among us? I smiled then, not as a teacher to a student, but as a friend to a friend. Because I am not leaving, I said. I am arising. The prophet once said, die before you die. I had tasted that truth. What most fear in their final hour, I had died into long ago. And when you die that way, before the body is done, death loses its teeth. It becomes instead an unlocking, a return. I knew where I was going. Or better yet, I knew that the place to which I was going was not a place, but a union. A folding back of river into sea. My body grew weaker. My sermons fewer. My voice, once full and resonant in the mosque, now whispered more than it sang, cracked more than it quoted. Yet there was such peace in that slow vanishing. I did not feel lesser. I felt lighter. The physical shell dimmed, yes, but what remained grew brighter by the day. The silence between breaths widened. The heart spoke more clearly than ever before. What had once come through poetry now came through stillness. Every moment became sacred. The scent of bread. The rustle of a bird's wing. The sigh of a student laying down his pen. I drank all of it. Spoke none of it. It was enough to be. I remember the final morning. There was a hush in the room, the kind that falls before a storm, only, this was not a storm of fury, but of grace. Everything felt golden. Timeless. As though the entire world was about to pause. Husam sat beside me, his inkpot full, his eyes already brimming. My family was close by, along with a few old friends who had followed me through fire and silence both. I spoke little. Just listened. To breath. To memory. To the far-off sound of a ney flute being played somewhere in the courtyard. That sound, it was the same note I had heard on the day Shams entered my life. The yearning note of reed separated from reed bed, crying to return. That was how I knew the circle was closing. What had begun in longing would end in union. I asked them one final time, when I pass, call it not an end. Call it Shabia Ruz, my wedding night. They thought I was being poetic. But I meant it in the deepest way. This life had been my courtship. My preparation. My purification. Now came the consummation. Now came the beloved, face unveiled, voice unmasked. The silence was full. And so I waited. I lay back against the cushions, closed my eyes just for a moment, and there it was. The doorway. The light. The ones. It felt less like leaving and more like entering. Less like ceasing and more like becoming. My final breath did not feel like an exhale, but like a return of the borrowed wind to its eternal source. And just like that, I was gone. But not gone. If you listen, truly listen, You will hear me in the turning of your own soul, in the quiver of your heart when it remembers longing, in a line of poetry that arrives out of nowhere and leaves you breathless, in the stillness after you forgive someone who never asked. You will find me there, because I was never just a man. I was a door, a mirror, a drop remembering it was the ocean. You may come to my tomb. People do. They walk through Konya's winding streets to lay roses on the marble. Some weep. Some pray. Some stand for long hours with their palms open to the silence. But I am not under that stone. I am not there. If you want to find me, turn inward. Close your eyes when the world grows too loud and listen. Listen for the stillness beneath all movement. Listen for the reed mourning its home. Listen for the place inside you that sings, even when your lips are silent. That is where I live. That is where I bloom. You are not a drop in the ocean, beloved. You are the entire ocean in a drop. And so am I.